I wrote a book in 1999 along with Imperial San Francisco. It's called Farewell Promised Land, Waking from the California Dream, and I did that with my photographer sidekick, Bob Dawson. The first chapter of that is called The Absence of Things, and the first sentence of that is, I noticed first the emptiness of the sky. And the point of that was that as rich as we think California is, biotically, it's in fact incredibly impoverished. We live in a pauperized environment, but we don't notice it because it happens slowly enough that we take empty skies for granted today. And people in the 19th century, as they were busy exterminating what was in the skies and in the seas and the bay and everything, would not have taken that for granted because it would have looked absolutely uncanny to them, this kind of vacuum. And the same is true of the media environment. San Francisco, like all other great cities, once had a rich and competitive media environment with three major newspaper dynasties who hated each other. And that was great because when I was working on Imperial San Francisco, if I wanted to find the dirt on the De Youngs, I'd go and read the Spreckles paper. And if I wanted to find the dirt on Hearst, I'd go and read the Spreckles paper. The Call was the best paper in the city at that time, kind of bull moose Republican, but the Spreckles family was so rich and independent that they kicked butt. And in Imperial San Francisco, the whole core of the book is called The Thought Shapers, because having worked in the media myself in the 80s, I was working in print media and in television at KRON, which was a De Young property just down the street. I worked there as well. I got really interested in media, and I particularly who owns this stuff and what's in it for them. So I have chapters on the Hearsts and the De Youngs. The De Young chapter was pretty difficult because their papers are not public. They may not even exist, although I suspect they do, but there's a lot that they want to hide, and for good reason. And then the Spreckles family, who play in there as well, too. And then there was the Bulletin, the kind of working man's newspaper with Fremont holders. So it was a pretty feisty environment. On August 15, 1913, the Chronicle banner headlined that the Call would be no more. That Mike De Young had bought the Call and would put it out of business. What people didn't know is that it was probably William Randolph Hearst who was financing the takeover of the Call, because a few years later it joined the Hearst stable of crummy, really crummy, sleazy newspapers. And De Young didn't own it. So they became complicit. It was what Upton Sinclair said in his wonderful book on the corruption of mass media, The Brass Check. It was stuffing the cat in the bag, because the information industry is such that you can't have anybody who really differs from the mainstream message, which is always pro-business. And that's certainly true of the Chronicle. Well, San Francisco's media environment, mainstream media environment, was sort of getting pretty weak. It was down to about really 2 newspapers by the 1960s, and then the Bay Guardian came to town. And when was it founded?
66.
66, okay. And it was a kick-ass newspaper, kind of like the Spreckles paper was. It really was good, and people read it. Everybody read it for the sex ads, of course, which were extremely lucrative at that time, the Berkeley Bar, all of them, you know. Well, one of the great things about The Guardian is that they did real investigative reporting, in which Tim had a big hand along the way. So they were ripped off the cover on how the city really is run and for whom it's run. My favorite issue was this one. Let's see, this was in 1984. 18th anniversary special, Up Against the Media Monopoly. great cartoon on the front, and it shows the two newspapers, the Hearst Examiner and the Young Chronicle, essentially lording it over people who are filling their minds with that junk from those two papers. And then you go on the inside, and they had done investigative pieces that resulted in the genealogies of those dynasties, those two, and then a land study of what land they owned. It was brilliant because you could see, especially during the age of redevelopment, why they would back it, because they were profiting personally from it. That's the kind of thing that you would never see in the Chronicle today. You probably wouldn't have seen it in the Examiner, although I will say that during the, I guess it was the 1980s when Will Hearst III, I think it was the third, yes, was running the Examiner. He did have ink in his blood, and he did do, they assigned my friend Jerry Adams, who was a really good gumshoe reporter, to do a series of articles called Circles of Power, which I thought should have gotten the Pulitzer, because again, it really showed how the city is run and for whom. So there was some investigative reporting. You really won't see investigative reporting in the Chronicle now, except on the Bay Bridge and a few other things. They have done a pretty good job of covering what an absolute debacle the Bay Bridge is. But they won't go into who really runs the town and who owns the land. And certainly they won't go into Feinstein and Blum's corruption. I found that out personally with the dust up with Audrey Cooper, now the managing editor of the Chronicle. In the, when was it, in the 70s, I think, there was a newspaper strike, and KQED, oddly enough, was still a public educational station at that time. Do we still have?
Yeah. Is that too much? I know people said it was too loud. Is it
Oh,
too
I can
loud?
Okay.
Too soft. Too soft. Okay, that's okay, keep going, and I will keep on monitoring.
All right. Well, the result of that was that at that time, KQED actually had a primetime magazine show called Newsroom. How many of you remember Newsroom? It was great. I mean, nothing like the one that they've got now. And what it did was it allowed the reporters from the papers, I think both of the papers at that time, to come in and be interviewed. And it was smart, gutsy, funny. They really broke stories. It was great. And it really made me respect the caliber of the people on those newspapers once they were given leash to really talk about how the city is run, and the state as well too. But they were a little bit too friendly to Cesar Chavez and labor, and so, as Dick Meister said, basically, by the way, the Chronicle used to have a labor page, a labor report. They basically, the board of KQED, which was increasingly rich and conservative, basically shut down Newsroom. So, let's see. Of course, then Rupert Murdoch started coming to town, to all of our towns. And, but as we all know, The Guardian was recently killed. It was kind of guttering along. Bruce Brugman had sold it, it was guttering, and then it was just suddenly shuttered. And I'm sure that Tim will talk about that a bit. And that, I think, was catastrophic. That's why I suggested that we do this, because in my point of view, essentially the Examiner no longer, well, I shouldn't say that. The Examiner does exist, and my friend Rachel Brahinsky, who worked at The Guardian and now teaches at USF, says it's actually becoming much better. I don't know because I live in the East Bay, so I don't see it. But she says that they're actually giving the reporters there more leash. I hope that's true, but that's only in San Francisco. The Chronicle is still basically the only game in town. I asked one of my friends inside the Chronicle one time, when the Chronicle was reported to be losing $1 million a week, how can they go on doing that? The Hearsts are fabulously wealthy, but they don't have bottomless pockets. And he said, it's because of the power that it gives them. The Chronicle still is read and really determines what is reasonable thought. such as, for example, cheering on the TPP and basically blasting anybody, including Nancy Pelosi, who raised any questions about the TPP. So what's happened, of course, as we all know, is that the liberal viewpoints have gradually been snuffed. And the disappearance of The Guardian, I think, is, from my point of view, catastrophic. In particular because so many of us use we use the Guardian's recommendations when we went to the polls. And that's not going to be there anymore, except apparently it will be online. But it was readily available in a news box, and we got that. And they had really gone through the things, and it really influenced the politics of the city. Gone. I wanted to also, before I close, mention from my own side of the bay another newspaper which has been largely forgotten, the Berkeley Daily Planet. This was started actually by 3 Stanford MBAs who thought that there was money in small newspapers. They were rapidly disabused of that. Then it was taken over by the O'Malleys, who had made some money in software, and they put it out at first twice a week. And Berkeley really depended on this newspaper. It was kind of the piazza of the city for discussing things, seeing issues and all, but they made a big mistake, and that was that they allowed a discussion of the Israel-Palestine issue, including in the letters to the editor, and in editorials as well, too. They were targeted by Zionists who essentially went around to their advertisers and intimidated them into dropping their advertising, and were largely responsible for driving them out of business. So the Daily Planet doesn't exist anymore. It's a real tragedy, but it shows where you don't go. The Chronicle basically will not carry, it carries very few letters on that, and that's for good reason. They said, a friend of mine in the Chronicle said, because it just never ends once you open that door. It just won't. The letters, the vituperation won't stop. So, which brings us finally to the future of journalism. What is it? Rachel Brahinsky is more optimistic than I am. She feels, as I said, that the Examiner is becoming better, and that there are all these online sources that are now available. And I don't know. Is this a gift? I'm really not sure. You don't see people reading papers much anymore. My friend Doug Buchwald, who just came in, has observed that since the Chronicle increased its newsstand price by 50%, people aren't buying it anymore. The news boxes are largely full at the end of the day. And you don't see people reading it very much on BART anymore. They're all hunched over this devil device. And are they getting news? When I teach over at Cal and I ask the students, how many of you read a newspaper in a class of 100? About 2 to 3 hold up their hands. So what are they getting on this thing that they're hunched over all the time? Well, if you look on BART, if you look over their shoulder, they're generally not reading The Guardian or the UK Guardian or anything. They're basically texting, sexting, gaming, whatever. This is one of the most, I think, seductive narcotics ever invented. They probably shouldn't be sold without a prescription. Well, I know, because ever since I got it, it's always calling from me. But I refuse to pull it out in public any more than I would anything else. It's just, you don't do that, especially on BART. Anyway, one last thing too. I just was going through my bookshelf before I came over, and in 1971, The Guardian published this book, The Ultimate High Rise, and I was just looking through it. This was when we actually had a discussion in San Francisco, because of The Guardian, about the economic and environmental consequences of high-rising the city. It is never discussed anymore. And it is gutsy, it's smart. The essays are as timely today as they ever were, particularly the essay on what happens in the event of earthquake in the high-rise district, in particular about fires in high-rises. You will never read about this in the Chronicle, and I can't get anybody else to cover it either. The growing likelihood that after the next great quake, fires are going to get into the high-rises in downtown as they grow denser and higher. I see no reason that that won't happen, and it terrifies me. My partner works in the downtown. I want him out of there as soon as possible because I think that it's a ticking time bomb and it needs to be discussed. But without the Guardian, I think it's not going to be discussed. So I've been talking too long. We've got a great panel here. Everybody has got other viewpoints, and so thank you for your patience.
Ray, I think you have one of probably 3 copies left of the Ultimate High Rise. I have one.
I will cherish.
It's really, really hard to find now. That was quite an adventure when the Guardian did. That was before my time. So I've been a political reporter in San Francisco for more than 30 years, much of that time with the long-lamented Bay Guardian, which I left in the middle of the night, shortly after it had been sold, a year after it had been sold, when I was informed by email that my resignation had been accepted. I didn't get along with the new owner. I want to talk a little bit, I'm going to play out a little bit about what Gray said, but also talk a little bit more about the history of the Chronicle and where we're going today. First of all, how many people in this room read the Chronicle every day? About half. All right. I'm with Gray. I teach, well, I'm about to get into that. I teach journalism. I teach journalism students at City College. And I always ask them on the first day, how many of you read the Chronicle? I mean, you're studying journalism. It's the biggest daily newspaper in town. Nobody. None of them read it. Nobody does. In fact, I hate to say this, being in that demographic myself, but virtually no one under 50 reads the Chronicle anymore. And that's just the reality. And that's one of the reasons that they're in the trouble that they're in. And I ask the students, why don't you read the Chronicle? And they say, why would I? There's nothing there for me. Right? I'm going to argue, and I'll get to that, that they are getting news. They're getting news from different sources, and that's both a good thing and a bad thing. But let's talk a little bit about how we got to where we are today with the San Francisco Chronicle. Right? And I'm going to take you back to the 1960s, when there were, as Gray says at one point, 4 competing daily newspapers in San Francisco, competing for readers, competing for revenue, competing for ads. When Jean Dibble, who was co-founder of the Bay Guardian, said she moved out to San Francisco, I think 63 or 64, and she was living in a flat with 3 other women. So there were 4 women. And in the course of the first 3 weeks they were there, they got 16 phone calls. Each of them got a phone call from each of the 4 daily newspapers trying to get them to subscribe. Because the daily newspapers were really competitive, and they were trying to get subscribers, and they were trying to get stories. All of that ended when the Call and the Bulletin were shut down, and the Examiner and Chronicle merged in 1965 in what's known as a joint operating agreement. Now, what essentially happened was the 2 competing papers agreed to stop competing. And what they did is they agreed to merge all their business functions so that there was only one classified advertising section that ran in both papers. There was only one set of display ads that ran in both papers. All the salespeople sold ads for both papers. In fact, I used to have fun with young reporters. I did this myself. You call the classified number for the Examiner and Chronicle, 777-7777. No one buys classifieds anymore, you used to. And you tell the person who answers the phone that you want to sell your bicycle in the Examiner. Because the Chronicle is circulated all the way from Eureka to Santa Cruz, and you just want to reach people in San Francisco, you want to sell it in the Examiner. And they would essentially, they go round and round, and, oh, it's much better if you buy both papers, it's better than the joint rate, it's cheaper. And you say, no, I don't want the joint rate, I just want the Examiner. And eventually they'd admit you couldn't do that. Because there was only one classified section. Both papers completely merged all their business functions, and then claimed they were running competing newsrooms. Right? But obviously, the financial incentive to compete was gone, because the way the deal was cut, every buck that the Chronicle made, 50 cents went to the Examiner. And every buck the Examiner made, 50 cents went to the Chronicle. Now, there was a big advantage to this. All right? It was a license to print money. And for many years, they made so much money off of this, hundreds of millions of dollars, that both families, the Hearst family and the Young-Terriot family, got very, very wealthy off of these daily newspapers. Right? They were able to hire a huge staff, and they took massive profits out. Right? By the 1990s, things were starting to change. And among the things that was starting to change was advertising practices. Something called Craigslist came along. And Craigslist, by the way, in the course of about 5 years, took about $300 million in revenue from the San Francisco Chronicle. Right? The Chronicle and Examiner used to bring in about $350 million in revenue from classified ads. The Guardian used to bring in about $2 or $3 million a year. That all just went away. And we saw that starting to happen. We saw that in 1994 when the unions went on strike, because management was looking for ways to save money. Not because they were losing money. You have to understand that at this point, daily newspapers around the country were making about 30 points. That means 30% on the dollar. That means every dollar of revenue, 30 cents of it was pure profit. That's what they were used to. That's what, under monopolies and joint operating agreements that we saw in daily newspapers around the country, that's what you made. You made vast profits. So when profits started to creep down to maybe 22 cents on the dollar, or 18 cents on the dollar, they started to freak and figured, okay, the first thing we got to do is get rid of a bunch of our staff, which is when they began, and others will talk about this, they began automating the presses, outsourcing them, finding ways to get rid of union printers. And then the next thing they did is they started saying, well, we're not going to sign a contract that gives the staff the kind of benefits that they used to have because we've got to save money. Now again, remember, the Chronicle was not losing money in 1994. The Examiner was not losing money. They just weren't making the extraordinary profits that they used to make. All right? So others will talk about the strike. But that was kind of the beginning of the decline of the daily newspapers in San Francisco. We got to the point where the Hearst Corporation, which owned the Examiner, decided they wanted to buy the Chronicle, because the Chronicle was the daily newspaper. The JOA relegated the Examiner to the afternoon slot, which guaranteed lower circulation. And Hearst Corporation wanted to be the powerhouse in town. They decided to buy the Examiner in, what, 1995?
No, that's 99.
99, yeah, right. So they decided to buy the Examiner, and then they were just going to shut it down. So there'd be only one newspaper in town. Right? I mean, you had two newspapers. The joint operating agreement was heading towards expiration. They were starting to think, well, we're making a lot of money with two non-competing newspapers. Think how much money we'd make if we didn't have to pay all that staff at the Examiner at all. What if we only had one newspaper and we'd absorb some of the staff, but we only have one daily newspaper in San Francisco? So they set out to buy the Examiner, and it's a long story, but essentially the federal government got involved and said, wait a minute, you can't just buy a newspaper and shut it down. There's antitrust laws against that. So Willie Brown, who was the mayor at the time, cut a deal with the folks at the Examiner and the Chronicle. And he worked out an arrangement where the Fang family, which owned a small newspaper in West Portland and a printing shop, the Fang family would buy the Examiner from Hearst. Hearst would buy the Chronicle. Then they would sell the Examiner to the Fang family to keep it as a competing paper. They would give it to them for nothing, for no money down. And they would give them about $20 million a year for 5 years to subsidize its operations. Sweet deal. No wonder that the Fang family supported Willie Brown in everything that he ever did. And in fact, Florence Fang, the matriarch of the family, used to walk around saying, this is Willie's newspaper, the Examiner. This is Willie's newspaper. Needless to say, it didn't get a lot of credibility. Most of the Chronicle staff, a lot of the professional reporters at the Chronicle, moved over to the Examiner or took buyouts. Or moved over to the Chronicle and took buyouts. The Examiner started with its own entirely new staff. And for a while it was a laughingstock, and then it was just kind of a failure. And then the Fang family decided to get out of it, and they sold it to a billionaire right-wing telecommunications guy from Denver named Phil Anschutz. And Phil had this theory that newspapers were too liberal. So he decided he wanted a conservative one. And he decided he would buy one in San Francisco, which made an awful lot of sense. But he had loads of money. He didn't care. So he bought the Examiner, put a lot of money into it, hired a lot of staff, and tried to make it a conservative newspaper, which was, by the way, an abysmal failure in San Francisco. Because this was not the place. Someone could have told this guy from Denver, this was not the place to start a conservative newspaper. So he eventually sold it off to the group that owns it now, which also owns the SF Weekly, and for a while owned the Bay Guardian. And one of the partners in this is also a minority owner in the BAR. So we've come from the Chronicle and Examiner monopoly to a different kind of monopoly that we're seeing now with a group out of Canada. That, you know, I will say there are some good people working at the Examiner now. They, years ago, picked up on the idea that they could do a free tabloid. By the way, the Chronicle never figured this out, but they should have. The money you make in newspapers is in advertising. The buck you pay for the Chronicle barely pays the person to go out and put it in the news box or deliver it to your door. The money is all in advertising. Right? The Guardian figured this out many, many years ago. So did all the other free alternative news weeklies. So what have we got now? We've got the Cron, which is a shadow of its former self. It really is. In terms of the size of the paper, in terms of the number of people working there, in terms of what they can actually do, it's a shadow of its former self. We got the Examiner, which has a few good reporters, and they're trying. They're being scrappy and they're trying. But I don't know if their business model's going to work long term. I don't even know if they're making money right now. I'm not privy to that, but I know that it's really, really tough. And I look at the size of that paper, 32 pages. I know from my work, if you're putting out 32 pages and 50% of it's ads, you're not making enough money to pay your staff. Right? And so it's tough times for the daily newspapers in San Francisco. Now let me take you back for a minute, because I actually have a point here, which is this. When I started in the newspaper business, I started at the Hartford Courant in Hartford, Connecticut, the city that always sleeps. And in Hartford, Connecticut, the Courant was a big monopoly, old newspaper that went back to the 1700s. When I started there, it was still family owned. It was sold to the LA Times the first summer I was working there. But the Courant owned Northern Connecticut. If it was not in the Hartford Courant, it did not happen. Right? It was the same way for a while. The Chronicle and Examiner owned San Francisco before the Guardian came along. If it was not in the Courant, if you were running for office and the Courant didn't care about you, you might as well give up. Right? Now, the flip side of that was the Courant was stinking rich. And we had a newsroom with about 350 or 400 people. And every little town in Connecticut, some towns with a population of 1,000, because there's a lot of little towns in Connecticut, had a full-time Courant reporter covering the Board of Education and covering the town selectmen or the village council and the police chief and everything else that's going on. And they really invested in journalism. We had an investigative reporting team of about 10 people that could spend a year working on a story because we were stinking rich. All right? Good news. There were a lot of reporters getting good union salaries, and there were a lot of reporters who had time to do big stories and big investigative stories, and there were reporters who covered every little town in Connecticut. Downside, if the editors at the Courant didn't think your story was important, it didn't exist. Right? It had so much power. The same way, for a while, the Chronicle and Examiner had that kind of power in San Francisco. Those days, for better or for worse, are over. That's gone. That is never going to happen again in the United States. We are never going to have one dominant print newspaper with a huge newsroom that dominates the arts, culture, political, the dialogue of the city. At the Courant and at the Chronicle, every morning I'd get into work, there'd be a stack of papers on the counter. The guy from AP would come and get one. Actually, he'd come around midnight when the first edition came out, and he'd go back and rewrite all the stories and send them out on the wire as AP. And then in the morning, the guys from all the TV stations would come and pick up their copy, and they'd go and rip the stories out and give them to their reporters to redo for the evening news. All right, that's the kind of power that a daily newspaper had. So the Guardian and the alternative press came along to challenge that, and I think we successfully did. Again, the era of the print weekly, alternative news weekly, and I hate to say this since it was my career, my life, is declining. And part of that is because of the internet, and we lost all of our classified advertising. Part of it, I think, is just demographic and psychographic. People aren't picking up, young people. Our audience was people between 18 and 35. They aren't picking up newspapers anymore. So that would be the bad news, except I don't think it's all bad news. I don't think it's all bad news. I do think that there's a generation out there that is hungry for news media. And I think that right now, the advantage we have is the barriers to entry are low. When I lost my job at the Guardian, I woke up the next morning, 55-year-old man, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I thought to myself, well, San Francisco's always needed a progressive, alternative daily newspaper. Now, if I had come to that conclusion in 1966 when Bruce Redmond started the Bay Guardian as a first every 2 weeks paper, then a weekly, that would have taken multiples of tens of millions of dollars. And I don't know anyone who'd write that check. And besides, if they did, I couldn't guarantee them they'd get any money back. On the other hand, it took me about $125 to buy the domain name 48 Hills and set up a website. Okay? And now I am running an alternative daily newspaper in San Francisco. It's not a blog, with all due respect. It's an alternative daily newspaper. A blog is where you sit around on your couch and comment on what everyone else says. We actually have reporters and writers who go out and cover the news and break stories and do investigative reporting. And it's a nonprofit. I've set it up as community supporting. That's one model. I'm hoping it'll work. I'm hoping that in 5 years I'll have a newsroom of 10 people, paid for by contributions, grants, and advertising. Okay? I think in 10 years, The Chronicle is going to be gone as a daily newspaper. I just don't see it surviving. I think the Examiner is going to be gone. I hate to say that, but I think that's what's going to happen. But the good news is, I think we're going to see half a dozen, 8, 10, 12 online daily publications in San Francisco with staff who are covering stories. There may be one that's devoted to sports, there may be one that's devoted to high culture, one that's devoted to low culture, like the Guardian used to cover, all kinds of different things. And they will be competing for stories because, and I always tell my students this, and this is where I promise I'm going to stop after this, the world cannot survive, democracy cannot survive without reporters. You have to have staff reporters who are paid to learn, understand, cover news, dig up information, get information that people don't already know, process that information, and deliver it to an audience. That's what reporters do. I used to get information, process it on a manual typewriter, send it to a press where it was transcribed into columns of type, and I delivered it to you on dead trees. All right? Then we processed it on computers that went directly to the press. Right? Now I do the same thing, except I process it without any dead trees at all. I just deliver it to you on the web. Right? I deliver it to you, with all respect to Gray, I deliver it to you on this, and I deliver it to you where, frankly, the next generation of people is reading stuff. I hope this model works. I think that the economic model for small, nimble, alternative publications is going to exist because it has to. Because if the Chronicle and Examiner are gone, people need that news and information. We cannot have a functioning democracy without it. So I think that model is going to emerge. I don't know exactly what it looks like yet, but I'm optimistic that that model will emerge, that instead of one newsroom with 400 people, you're going to have 8 or 10 newsrooms with 6, 8, 10 people. And I hope that works. So I'm also going to apologize now. I'm going to have to leave here at about 8:30 because I have to take a phone call at 9. I'll stay as long as I can. But I really want to thank all of you for coming and listening to me. And if you have questions for me, and I don't have time to stay and answer them, my email is really easy. It's timredmondsf, like the city, timredmondsf@gmail. And I'm always happy to...
Yeah, those damn corporations. Hate those SOBs. I have to apologize for my speech. I had an accident. Charlie Tobias punched me out and I was trying to steal his wallet. And unfortunately, I didn't get the wallet, but he sort of disabled me slightly. So I'll do the best I can. I'm going to talk about the strike. I just want to make a couple of comments just inspired by some of what I've heard about. One thing, for instance, the crazy economics of the newspaper with the paper in their business. For instance, if you noticed the news the other day, the Japanese company, now I'm blanking on it because I'm nervous, I guess, NKA or NEK or something, bought the Financial Times.
Nikkei.
Nikkei. Oh, Nikkei, not the acronyms for the public broadcast thing. I don't know what.
NHK.
No, it's a Nikkei.
Anyway, they bought the Financial Times and they paid a buku zillion dollars. If you read that story in the New York Times about the purchase of the Financial Times, one of the reporters at the Financial Times worked out the per reporter price of that sale. It was like $1.6 million, and the reporter said that's a really cheap price for a reporter. I think it was $1.6 million. So there is a capitalist somewhere in Japan who thinks a reporter is worth something like $1.6 million. It blows away all of the models for valuation of news properties. They're not newspapers, by the way, they're properties. If you look at the Boston Globe price, it's peanuts. When I myself was the union guy at that point in 2009, and the Chronicle, the Hearst Corporation, threatened to close the Chronicle. They were going to try to sell it, but they didn't expect anybody was going to buy this dog. They were going to try to sell. They couldn't sell it. If the unions didn't agree to basically eat a big, can I say an adult phrase? Just shit sandwich. We didn't eat a big shit sandwich, us and the Teamsters, in order and like it. If we didn't do that, they were going to sell the paper, and if they couldn't sell it, they were going to shut it down. And they had just done it kind of like that in Seattle. They closed the PI, the Post Intelligence Service. So I thought they were not bluffing. Some people argue to this day they were bluffing and we should have just gone on strike or something, but we didn't. We ate the shit sandwich. So there is still a Chronicle, but at that time I met this great rich capitalist guy, Warren Hellman, the late Warren Hellman. We had breakfast with him. We talked Warren into trying to buy the Chronicle. And what was our offer? If anybody can guess, how much did we offer to buy the San Francisco Chronicle in 2009? Nobody wants to guess. Are you all asleep? Guess.
$2 million per report.
Wrong. We told them we will buy the Chronicle if you pay us $25 million a year. That was our bid. And Hellman is a pretty smart guy. He pointed out we're losing twice that, so we're going to save you half of your losses. This is the best deal you ever were offered in your life. And Wilhurst considered that and decided to reject that idea. And so the result was we started something called the Bay Citizen, which, does anybody remember that and read that? It's in the New York Times. How many people read the New York Times every day? A couple. I think that's a pretty good paper. I get the Chronicle and the Times delivered every day in Bayview. And I know on my street there's 3 people that get the Chronicle delivered. I walk my dog, I see it. And I'm the only one that gets the New York Times. They come in the same truck. There's no Teamster involved, by the way. They're all independent contractors. So it's really crazy. You know, I think the economics right now for a newspaper are pretty shaky, but not so bad as some may think. I also would just say that, although I don't argue with Tim too much on this, newspapers, I go around all the time saying this is a dead business, just doesn't know it yet. But I represent the industry, the workers in that industry throughout California and Hawaii. And I think it's risky to predict the future based on just continuing the trend of today. Who would have thought the biggest name in publishing in this year would be Atticus Finch? I mean, nobody would have predicted something like that. You know, my son, he's 26 or something, going on 14. He's buying vinyl records, like that's the hip thing. You know, I'm wearing this old-fashioned looking clothes. I don't know, this is kind of not that hip. I thought I'd be wearing a spacesuit by now, you know, when I was a kid. You know, it's not necessarily true that people are done with news, let's say newspapers like Frances Dinkelspiel in Berkeley. Didn't mention her in Berkeley. She puts out Berkeley Side, which is not bad. And if you look on that website, it says the newspaper without the paper. She's got a bunch of staff. I don't know if she pays them, probably not. But there's a bunch of staff. They do pretty good work. And I see a lot of stuff that I really feel good about. Like, for instance, on the Big Island in Hawaii, Terrible Daily was wrecked by the Stevens Media rotten company. They make the Hearst Corporation look like the most progressive, generous company on the face of the earth. The Hilo paper is so bad. Somebody started a couple of blogs over there, West Hawaii Today, or Hawaii Today, Big Island Today. Really damn good. And the news, I don't think on the Big Island it's ever been more vigorous than it is right now. I think Tim's doing great work. I see some of that stuff once in a while, not every day. I probably should look at it more often. So when you can send me an email every time you refresh it with something decent, okay? Just send me an alert. And just kidding. There's a lot of good people out there. Now, I'm starting to teach at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, and I've been amazed at the talent coming in to the journalism school. These kids, they're mostly kids, 20s, let's say, they are incredibly smart young people. They have skills, and I don't even know what the hell they're talking about. I mean, I barely figured out Facebook, okay? I figured out Instagram recently. I sent about 80 tweets in my life. A couple hundred people are following me. I think, what the hell, stop following me. I finally figured out Twitter a little bit. But these kids nowadays, they are so hip to this stuff. They're making movies. They're making movies and they're 20 years old. I couldn't even find a way to get into a movie. And they're making multimedia. They are really hip storytellers. And I don't think they're stupid. I don't think they're ignorant of the news. Somehow they find it. I don't see them taking the Chronicle. I mean, who walks around with a effing Chronicle? Anyway, even though I do. Just because I swat stuff. I like to wave it when it's hot. But you don't necessarily need the paper. So that's my little spiel. We should lose our romantic attachment to the means of production that the past information system was based upon. Even though we loved that era, there were unions there and jobs and money and all kinds of stuff. But come on, folks, the internet is hardly new, is it? It's a social imperative, and that's going to change everything. Not just news. Look at where you buy your pants and clothes. Do you go to Macy's? Probably not. Some of you do. Okay, the strike. I got 5 minutes. I don't want to go long because everybody's kind of hot. I was asked to talk about the strike, so let's talk about that. That strike in 1994, for me, it's the proudest thing I ever did in my life. 11 days of pure solidarity. We had all kinds of arguments before that strike, and the minute the strike settled, and Mark was there, you guys, he's got one of the old papers, they started shitting all over us. You know, you sold out the strike, you should have kept the picket lines up longer, you bastards. We started arguing with each other. 5 minutes later, right? We're still arguing. It's like, screw you, by the way. So that's just a joke. So, anyhow, the solidarity, for me at least, was the purest thing, even more pure than when I got married, because I was thinking, how can I cheat? You know, so weren't you all thinking that? But when in that strike, I was just 100% solidarity. And I can't say that in a way that doesn't make you think, oh, you're shitting me. No, you weren't. It's true. I was thinking nothing but solidarity. How can I keep this union movement together? Now, here's my story. I was a reporter at the Chronicle for 20 years, okay? Not one of their worst, probably not their best, but close to their best, wouldn't you say? Never been as good as a paper was when I worked there. That's for shit sure. So, okay, so I was a middle of the road. Don Lattin was probably the best. He's a religion writer, right? You were the best, right? Science and religion, and Laura was also great. A couple of journalists here from the Chronicle in those days. Anyhow, Doug Cuthbertson asked me to come off the job and put the Conference of Newspaper Unions together, kind of help it get together at the shop steward level. That was my assignment. And it was like a dream assignment for me, being a union lunatic from childhood. To just, all I had to do was try to get a joint stewards council together. I put out a joint bulletin. I went around to everybody's rallies. I made t-shirts. It was just such fun for a year. And the strike was when it all kind of hit the streets. And that strike, for those, how many were here in 1994 and remember that strike? That was not a teacher strike where everybody's kind of polite and, yeah, give us a contract, please. Or in Seattle, when the Times went on strike, I went up there. They were looking at me like I was nuts because I was chasing the scabs around. They were like, oh, you got to be respectful. Fuck you. The scabs, it's chasing out. He's like a rat. He's like an insect. And I was like a freak up there because they were like, oh my God, this guy's some kind of nutcase. That San Francisco strike was a vicious, it was a nasty, it took over the city in a way that I actually have not seen in any labor dispute. Even those great hotel workers and the Safeway strike, the newspaper was on every corner, every store, almost every house. I was pulling the paper out of people's hands. I'd be driving around and I'd see a perfectly nice woman like you standing there reading the scab paper. I would stop my car or get off my bicycle. I'd go and say, I need that paper. Deep penetration of the labor mentality. I knew nothing about your issues. I couldn't even figure out what the hell you were talking about. He's the Pressmen. He's going to explain it to you. I had no interest in what they were striking about. It was all in the guild, the newsroom. I think, Don, you could maybe vouch for this. Did you know what the hell we were striking for? I didn't. I was running the thing. I had no idea. Something about Manning or something. I had no idea what it was about. For me, the guild, which is half of the newspaper workforce, 1,200 out of the 2,200, was all about supporting the other unions. It was an unselfish strike for us that had almost nothing to do with our issues. And that's why it was so pure. And for our unit of 1,200 or something like 1,000, I think we had 4 cross that picket line. 4. None of them lasted, by the way, a couple of weeks after that strike was over. That would be great to get something like that going again. The lesson for me in that strike was that solidarity and purity of heart is what wins, okay? And it's good to have smart tactics like Charlie and Doug and Mark and people that knew what the hell the issues were about, okay? All I cared about was getting that effing paper out of your hand. It's all. And not getting anybody hurt and having a hell of a good time. We dipped our toe into the great river of American working class revolution, okay? It lasted 11 days. Did we win? I thought we won myself. Later I was told no, we didn't. We kind of fucked it up, okay? So these guys will explain how we snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. But I believe that despite all the trends of today, and we're going to lose the Abood case. How many know what that means? There's a case called Abood. The public sector unions are in the crosshairs of the bad guys, and they're about to be rubbed out, okay? They're going to be rubbed out, just like we in the private sector have already been rubbed out, pretty much. And it's going to look bad. It's going to look worse before it looks better. But I will hazard a prediction that people will still want news. There'll still be somebody telling stories. There'll still be somebody trying to create stories. They'll find a way. And there will be a day before maybe I'm even fixed my dental stuff up, when the glimmer or the spark of a pure return of the idea of solidarity of the working people will start to become hip again, maybe. And just like vinyl records or fedoras or being polite to people or maybe not using bad words when you're speaking to people, which I haven't quite gotten so good at that yet, that these kinds of things which seem like dead, never again, they'll come back. Just like already you're seeing it happen with some of the low-wage workers and the $15 and Bernie Sanders. So don't give up that shit. If you're crushed, you sell out, you screw up, that's happened all through history. The only real defeat is to defeat yourself. And that's my lesson for the day.
Could you say a word too about the Indian paper, the Free Press?
Thank you for the round of applause. I think it was the jokes, not the other part. I would like, at the will of the chair, and by the way, I was going to say something about ethnic cleansing in the program. I would call it more like an ethnic tidying up that's going on. It's not quite ethnic cleansing, Steve. That's what they did in Serbia. This is not quite that. But it is an ethnic tidying up. Anyhow, that's what we have to talk about. The 94 strike had a lasting impact on the communications business because the internet was just kind of happening. In all our stories, I think I was in the business section in '93, every time we'd mention the internet or the World Wide Web, we'd have to explain what it was. Because nobody knew what it was. You say it's the graphic-rich portion of the internet, which is a collection of news of computers that somebody had something to do with. It was exotic. But when that strike happened in '94, we had just started the gate, SF gate. It was new. And these brilliant guys, what was that guy's name? I can't remember his name now, I'm sorry. The two guys at the strike had the bright idea, Phil Kuhn, right? That's from the Examiner. His name, Bruce Kuhn, and some other guy. They decided, why don't we put the SF Free Press, our strike paper, which looked like this, thing like this on paper. Why don't we put it on the World Wide Web? And this was like, wow, that's a great idea. And so we were the first strike newspaper online. Not only that, that was the first any kind of paper online. The Scab Chronicle and Examiner also went online, but they didn't have any news in there. They just made this shit up. They had no reporters, okay? We started the first, out of that strike, the working people at the newspaper guild. I think, maybe you can look this up, there was a story in the Boston Globe, I don't think I'm making this up. I think anywhere in the world, you could say the first general interest online, regular daily news outfit thing was the San Francisco Free Press, the strike paper. And we're very proud of stuff like that. Nobody knows that history. I wish maybe you'd write a PhD thing about that.
One is enough.
Is that what you...
Well, like Carl said, what happened in that strike, there was great unity amongst us. The real issue was with the Teamsters being downsized. and we supported him. But let me start from the beginning. I had a lawyer named Brian Walsh, a fantastic lawyer. I was meeting with him, and we were talking about King and Ballou, who were hired by the Chronicle. They're a union-busting outfit. And he said to me, he heard from a lawyer in Chicago, don't get into a legal battle with them because they're going to try to bankrupt you. So that was great knowledge because he was right. What they did was they came into the press room, they started unilaterally making changes, cutting jobs, basically instituting new discipline policies. The workforce was harassed on a daily basis. They turned the press room into a war zone. Basically, they told the managers there, do what you want to do. If you have a problem, tell the union to file a grievance. Let them take it to arbitration. So after a while, we started seeing the trend. We had to file grievances every day. We went to the NLRB and filed charges there. This was a union-busting campaign. And let me tell you something, it's tough, especially when you're a union leader, to deal with it. Because you got your members that are all scared. They're all saying, you know, we're finished. There was a lot of despair. It was tough. But we did start to get the membership engaged. And I told them, if everybody does a little bit, we can win. But I need your help. So I had my members go to the NLRB, help me with filing charges, because I was spread out all over. They were trying to burn me out. So I asked my members, all of them, you know, you got to do a little bit, and we'll be fine. So we went to the NLRB. They had to send lawyers to the NLRB. We had arbitrations. Some of them I did. We tried to spend their money, and we would send our members instead of, you know, hiring lawyers for every beef, which is what they were hoping we would do. But their whole concept was they wanted to basically bust the union, weaken the union, and then implement their agenda, which was basically lower the workforce and real strict work rules. And, you know, we were a fighting union. We weren't going to take it. So we fought back. But let me tell you, it was tough. But what I found out is if you can engage your members, instead of being in despair, engage them. Tell them, look, you get involved, and they started to feel the power, and we started to see change. We started actually seeing that the company was getting worried. They were spending money with these lawyers and getting no results. In fact, they had a suite down on Mission Street where they would have these lawyers fly in from Tennessee. They had this suite, I don't know, they paid thousands of dollars a year for them. And they had 5 lawyers on staff all the time. And so we started telling management, hey, look, you know, we're going to spend your money. We're going to send our people there. You want to pay for these people? Fine. We'll help you spend your money. Finally, I think the Chronicle got the drift. This wasn't working. And although the strike probably didn't end like we wanted it to, because we probably should have had some more things written down that they wouldn't really retaliate against us, because when we came back from the strike, they did retaliate. And, you know, because we had supervisors who were union members who they took out of the bargaining unit because they classified them as supervisors. So they were scabs. So we had actually scabs in our department, and there was a lot of bad blood. But after a while, it settled down. And then they finally got rid of King and Ballou and Hale. And it did change. But, you know, unfortunately, we're not there. The Pressmen's union doesn't exist anymore. But I will say this, that my union fought, and they fought hard. And we beat corporate America. We beat these guys. We spent their money. My members helped spend their money and make it a terrible decision to bring union busters into San Francisco. I had help from the media. My media help was coming from radio hosts like Ray Taliaferro, and I went to KGO. I talked to a lot of the disc jockeys that were on there, and they helped tremendously. And the one thing that I see that we need to get back is we need to get the progressive voices back on the radio, because they were a big help to us. We won the moral high ground argument. When the Chronicle brought in King and Ballou, I was calling Ray Taliaferro and some of the other hosts, telling them that the Chronicle had hired union busters. So they were real receptive to it. I said, you know, these guys are from Tennessee. They don't even belong here. And you know, they're coming here to bust our union. And right away, we won the moral battle. We won the battle, the moral high ground with the public, with San Francisco. And that was huge. And the Chronicle knew we had basically the backing of the public, which you got to have. But what I'd like to see happen in San Francisco again is I'd like to see some more progressive voices on the radio. There was a station called Green 960 who had Tom Hartman, one of the smartest minds in progressive radio. You had Stephanie Miller, you had Norman Goldman, you had great voices that they took off the air. Romney took them off the air after he lost his election because he owns Clear Channel. We lost those voices. We lost Ray Taliaferro. Those were the voices that we need back on the radio. We have to have progressive voices back. That's where I see we need to go. And what Carl says is there is an uprising coming up in this country for labor again. If you see that the fast food workers are fighting for the minimum wage up to $15, you can feel it. You see the Black Lives Matter. They want, not only do they want, you know, fairness and to be treated like everybody else in this world, but they also want economic justice, because that's part of it too. So anyway, there is this faction coming up. There is this growth with the movement of Bernie Sanders. There's a lot of people out there that want change, and a lot of it has to do with workers getting a fair shot. So I think what Carl was saying is true. There is something coming up, and we may be at the verge of another union movement in this country. And I haven't given up hope. I'd like to see it. I'm retired now, but I still love the union. I love the city, and I owe the union everything. My father was a union member. My mother was a union member. Basically, my family, I wouldn't have what I have now if it wasn't for the union. So I just want to end that, you know, the future looks good. I think things are changing. We might go through some hard times, but I think eventually people are going to rise up and make unions strong again.
I've been a freeway flyer for the last few years, lecturing at various colleges, and I once had a student come up to me from the back room and say, "Could you please tone it down, you're too loud." So I'm not sure if I need this thing, but I will use it anyway. Now, I could talk at great length about what it was like for printers, and maybe Charlie will want to raise his hand and say a few words, but being as I'm the last speaker and I don't want to speak for half an hour, I won't get into, for example, why it is printers always refer to the two papers as the Exonical and the Chronometer. But there are production reasons for that. We worked, some nights I'd be working on a flat for the Chronicle and a flat for the Chronicle side by side on the same frame. But anyway, instead what I want to do is talk about the strike. And absolutely, like Carl said, like Mark said, this is a remarkable strike, a tremendous outburst of solidarity like no other strike, like very few other strikes, I should say, of the last period. Most strikes of the last 30 or 40 years, ever since the defeat of PATCO, have seen unions be smashed, one after another. It was different in the Chronicle strike, although I do agree that, like Carl said, I'm one of those people who believes that we snatched defeat out of the jaws of victory, but that was a strike we were winning. There was two things that was different about this strike than a lot of other strikes, besides the things that have already been mentioned, all of which are valid. One is, well, the first I was going to mention was the alternate paper. There's one additional thing I want to say about it, besides being the first paper on the web. During the strike, and I believe Carl can confirm this for me, it had a considerably higher circulation than did the scab paper. That's what I heard.
Not paid, it was free.
Well, it was free, but there's more people reading it than were reading the ratty little scab paper with practically no one writing for it. The second thing that was different about this strike from so many other strikes, and to some degree Carl touched on this already, was that this was a strike in which the objective was not just to have a corporate campaign, not just to win popularity from the general public, though we certainly did both things very effectively. It was very well organized, but to physically prevent the paper from being used. That was how this strike was different from so many other strikes. Now, and the key to the strike was in fact producing the paper. The paper was produced at 3 plants, one in Richmond, one on Army Street here in San Francisco, and one in Union City. And on the first night of the strike, the Richmond plant and the Union plant, City plant, were shut down and did not work for the rest of the strike. And that is why it was such a skimpy little paper coming out of Army Street. That was the great success that this strike had that so many others didn't have. And as I'll get to that in a bit, by the end of the strike, the Armory Street plant was on the verge of being shut down as well when we had the compromise settlement. That is the huge difference between this strike and so many other strikes. Now, I was personally, I had run for union office, hadn't won in the spring, and I was one of the 2 delegates from my union to the Joint Picket Committee. I got thrown off after the first week because the guy from the International didn't like some of the things I said in the meeting. Carl probably remembers this one. But anyway, being a glutton for punishment, I kept going to the meetings right to the bitter end, even though they even passed a motion saying that I shouldn't speak. But I sat there and listened and took notes, so I was pretty familiar with all the planning for the strike. So I think I can speak knowledgeably about it, and especially since the first night of the strike, I sat around that picket committee headquarters, which is a big mistake, and finally someone, I guess to get rid of me, sent me down to Union City. And I'm very glad he did that. So I was there for 10 days in the heart of the strike in Union City. Now, one thing, I actually wrote about that because after the strike ended, the free press, by those who did not want to see the strike, and continued it as a new free press, which is because at the time the Teamsters and the Pressmen were quite unhappy with things went. So the new free press actually had considerable backing for a while and went going for a while. And I wrote for it under a pseudonym, J. Reed. And I'm actually going to read to you from the piece that I wrote for the new free press, you know, my journalistic endeavor, describing what went down in Union City, because I think it described much better I described much better 20 years ago what it was like down there than I could describe it now. The 11-day San Francisco newspaper strike was no ordinary strike. It was a bitter struggle. It was class war. It was the most dramatic and important thing happening in the Bay Area in early November. And it received miserably poor coverage in the local news media, including even in the strikers' own paper. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's the way I felt at the time. One of the most important battles in this war took place in Union City, a town that maybe now deserves its name. I had the privilege of serving my picket duty there. I'm not necessarily the best person to tell the story of the strike there, because I don't work in the Union City plant and didn't picket there on the first night, but somebody has to, so I'll do my best. The Union City plant is the largest the San Francisco newspaper agency possesses and technologically the fanciest. Before the strike started, some union activists had worried it would be tougher to shut down the Armory Street plant, what with its huge size, its 9 different gates, and its location out in the sticks. Well, that's not how things turned out. The Cronex magnates thought they would intimidate the strikers with their mafia-style goon squad from the Huffmaster Security Company with their pseudo-paratrooper uniforms. No doubt they thought it was a big coup when they produced a trial scab edition of the Redmond plant, stuffed into trucks, and ran over a union picketer, breaking his leg 2 weeks before the strike deadline the unions had set. But their sadistic arrogance blew up in their faces. On the first night of the strike, the workforce of the Union City plant mobilized all out to teach the thug sadists a lesson, and the lesson was taught. Union City is a small town with a small police force, and the Huffmaster Goon Squad did not have a small army of police to protect them from the workers as they did in San Francisco. They received a thorough shellacking. The company never again tried to produce anything there for the duration of the strike. They crippled the scab paper. Without the fancy computerized sorting and bundling equipment in Union City, it is extremely difficult to put together the usual Sunday paper with advertising inserts, the pink sections, the comics, etc. That's why the only scab Sunday paper produced looked hardly any different from the usual skimpy daily. I started picketing at Union City the second night of the strike on the 8 to midnight shift. The most immediately noticeable thing was how thoroughly the strikers had intimidated the goons. They mostly cowered inside the big plant, far behind the barbed wire fence. Occasionally you see a Huffmaster creep from door to door. Sometimes one would slip into a truck and careen madly across the huge empty parking lot at top speed. Mostly they stayed as far away from the strikers as they possibly could. On the second night, the strikers felt disinclined to allow the Huffmasters to peacefully conduct their shift change. The ensuing incident was covered on Channel 2 News. Afterwards, the police spoke to the picket captain, pointing out that no papers were leaving the plant, so why not allow the shift change? From then on, a nightly ritual took place with picketers pulling their lines briefly out of the way of about a third of Union City's small police force in full riot gear. The gate would open, a car or sometimes a van would come out, another would go in. Even with 50 to 30 cops to protect them, the Huffmasters were scared stiff. You could see them literally shaking in their boots, just like in the old cliche. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Continuing. One night they were so scared that the Huffmasters closing the gate actually managed to knock the right side of the gate over. After they managed to right it, they then scurried away without even latching it properly. The Union City Police Force also seemed rather disinclined to tangle head-on with the strikers. They played an ugly double game, first claiming they were neutral or even on our side. I remember one of them going up to me and saying, "Oh, we're all just workers' beats together." And then engaging us in ugly, escalating, petty harassment. They took away the Union porta potty, then eagerly patrolled around hunting for Unionists using the bushes so they could bust them. The harassment reached its peak one night when a deaf printer named Jack Aaron was picketing during the nightly shift change. Not being able to hear the police orders to move away from the gate, he was grabbed, wrestled to the ground, handcuffed, and beaten, just like Rodney King. And just like Rodney King, Jack Aaron is suing. On Wednesday, November 9, the Cron X hired legal goons managed to obtain an injunction which the police leafleted picketers with during my shift. We could have no more than 4 picketers per gate, and a string of other restrictions were placed on us. No restrictions were placed on the Huffmaster thugs. I guess that First Amendment stuff about freedom of assembly only applies to rich people and their hired goons. The picket captain called headquarters for advice and was told, "Negotiations are going well right now, let's not rock the boat, do exactly what police tell you." Fortunately, this advice was, as so often happened during the strike, ignored. The picketers continued to do what they damn well pleased. On the last 2 nights of the strike, the Union City Police suddenly were nowhere to be seen. Apparently, they understood better than our union officials that this injunction was unenforceable. So that's what it was like. I'll add one more thing. On the weekend, I went out patrolling. That's the story of the Pressmen, story of the Teamsters. On the weekend, I went out patrolling with the Teamster squad. The Union City plant was so huge that it had its own railhead, so that papers could be, trucked to and from the railhead. So go by rail to San Francisco. So we went down there, in a truck. And sure enough, there was one scab guarding the railhead, and he ran as soon as we saw us. As I rode in the truck, the Teamster I was with, well, even at this date, I probably should be unspecific, he was carrying various legally challenged materials. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Now, on towards the end of the strike, the reason that they didn't get any paper out at all was because they still had the Army Street plant producing. Why was this? What other people told me was because that at Army Street, that was in San Francisco, so unlike in Richmond and Union City, where the picket committee was being ignored and the Pressmen were doing whatever they wanted, the picket committee orders were being more followed in Army Street, and what I heard was that was why the Army Street plant had not been. That's third hand from people whose names I don't remember. I will say I did hear that there were 3 different plans at the last one to shut down the plant, secret plans, but I was aware of one of those plans, which at this point, since the guy I told you about is deceased, I think I can safely, without mentioning his name, say what the plan was. So there was a printer who I knew, bit of an odd duck, who had a friend who owned a private plane. And apparently the plan was he was going to borrow the private plane and bomb the plant. Okay. That's the kind of strike it was. Okay. That's the kind of strike.
There was a lot of hostility.
Yeah. Okay. I'll say, now I want to say a few things about my close friend, John Bryan. I was hoping that you would mention a word or two about him. Now, alternative newspapers. The first alternative newspaper in the Bay Area was published in the late 60s by a man named John Bryan. It was one of the first alternative newspapers in America. That was before my time. I know that might have been the Oracle or something like that. He ran a string of underground newspapers for the next 30 years. The most recent one, which went down the ages, called Appeal to Reason. But anyway, I met him in 1989 as a fellow printer at the Oakland Tribune. And we became friends, and when the Oakland Tribune went bankrupt in '92, which is where I went from the Oakland Tribune to the Chronicle, he and I got together and were issuing leaflets, and we're trying to get together the unions together to try and do a planned sit-down strike. We actually run a room and everything, had a meeting. Anyway, it didn't go over. So both he and I ended up at the Chronicle later, and we were good friends. And he had all sorts of experience in producing newspapers. although his newspapers gradually gone bust. So since he had experience in circulating newspapers, he was made the circulation director of the Free Press. And so when the strike ended, a lot of unionists didn't like, particularly among the pressmen and the Teamsters, were opposed to ending the strike. So he simply took the paper over, called the New Free Press, and he was able to do this because he was getting financial backing from the pressmen and the Teamsters. Mark, you probably remember about that. And I've got a couple issues of the paper here, including the one which had my piece in it, and advertising and so forth. So while it was still an issue, the paper was going for a while. I've got a picture here, his interview with the president of the Teamsters, Andy Serkelis. I'll actually show that, because he was the main leader of the Teamsters, and here he is. And the centerpiece of this issue was a lengthy interview with Andy Serkelis, who was the head of the Teamsters. Now, Andy was one of the people who thought that the strike, we had won a victory. But then, as Mark explained, when the strike was over, you had an agreement after the strike was signed, according to which the contract would be suspended for just a few weeks and let the management do whatever they want to get this paper going again. Boy, was that a mistake. And the union took that and drove through that loophole like a truck. As Serkelis himself got beaten up by scabs a few weeks after the strike, which might be one of the reasons why, at the moment, I'm not sure if he's still alive, but he's had Alzheimer's for a number of years. People haven't heard from him. This interview here talks about his feelings of betrayal and what he thinks needs to be done. We've heard about some of the things that happened with the Pressmen. In my own union, the main representative on the picket committee was Fred Ferguson, also not around. And Fred, I had a lot of disagreements with Fred. He actually thought the strike was a victory. And in fact, our union was the first one to prove it, and to a considerable degree, because I think Fred Ferguson was pushing for it to be approved. That's one of the reasons. And he really believed it was a victory, to the point that in negotiations with management, he actually, right in the middle of negotiations, called a scab, right in front of the management negotiations. He thought he could get away with that because he thought we had won the strike. Well, he got fired. And we spent the next year defending him. We finally managed to get his job back. I was involved in that. I was on the labor support committee for our union. I was, doing a lot of fundraising for that. So, anyway, similarly, I'll say also, in putting this thing together, I've been trying to get a speaker from the Pressmen and the Teamsters, and I finally managed to speak to Rudy Galvez, who is the current business agent. Both Web 4 and the old Teamsters Lucas have been merged into an East Bay Teamsters look. There's hardly anything left of them. So Rudy Galvez, I spoke to him, and he would have loved to speak, except he's one of the last Teamster drivers, and he's driving tonight. And he told me that he himself, it was a horrible memory for a lot of Teamsters. He himself was suspended for 9 months after the strike. I believe out of the 600 drivers, despite the settlement saying that supposedly the reduction in force would only be through layoffs, only 150 drivers out of the 600 drivers were working immediately after the strike. The other 450, including Rudy Galvez, didn't have their jobs back. It took quite a while for any of them to get their jobs back. And so he told me that a lot of the Teamsters, it's just a horrible memory for them, and they don't even want to think about it. And that's why he tried to find a Teamster speaker for me, and he did not succeed when I was talking to him. And, okay, so, the last thing I want to talk about is John Bryan's strike paper. We made it out, and the John Bryan, he had been an old underground newspaper guy. He was sort of the last new leftist in captivity in America, best way I can describe him. And in his last days, he tried to turn it back into another underground newspaper. It failed, and a while back he committed suicide. So that's the story of John Bryan.
I was president of the Typographical Union in 1994 when we went on strike. Before that, I just recently received my 50-year pin as a member of the Typographical Union and CWA, or International. Before I was president, I was a union organizer for 9 years. One of the shops I tried to organize was the Bay Guardian. Unfortunately, we were on strike for 9 months, and Berkeley beat us over 25 cents an hour. So you can see my opinion of Berkeley is not all that good. Anyway, Our union represented about 9 daily newspapers in the Bay Area and a number of commercial shops. At the time of the strike, we had about 400 members and about 150 at the Chronicle. Prior to negotiations, we had a conference of newspaper unions composed of 11 different unions. It was very difficult in going into negotiations trying to support every particular union. But through the various unions, we were able to do that. We had Doug and Carl, and we had Mark and Andy Circalis, paper workers, the mailers, Dave Ellis, and all of us were more or less on the same page. And we had agreed that no union would take a contract to the members until all the unions were negotiated and all the language was there. Unfortunately, the last couple of days, negotiations were around the clock, and a lot of us made mistakes. Made mistakes basically in transcribing language that was agreed to for both parties, management and the unions. Our own particular union, we came out of this pretty good. We had probably our best collective bargaining agreement in a long time. Other unions were not so successful, and there was a lot of pressure on the various unions to reach an agreement. So prior to the strike, we all met, and we decided we couldn't go any further. We concluded negotiations. I think we were at some hotel, and the union or the company representatives called a recess, and during that recess, we decided to strike, and that's what we did. It lasted 11 days. It was a militant strike. For our particular union, I called it a rank and file strike. I was able to call on all members of the union, regardless of who they were, and all of them contributed. My particular role was continuing negotiations and overseeing what was going on. But most of the daily nuts and bolts stuff was all done by the rank and file, and they did that. I remember the union strike headquarters on St. Mary's. It was an old building. And I remember the rain coming down and going out to the picket line and seeing our members. I remember them coming in to go on duty, and the printers would go into the strike headquarters, change out of their clothes and put on rain gear, just like they were going to lunch, you know, and to work. In fact, some of them did carry their lunch too, but we had a lot of support in the city. We were blessed with gourmet meals from all the big restaurants in the city. We had our own press room and newsroom, and it was really an uplifting period of time for me. You know, this wasn't my first strike. I think during my tenure as president and as an organizer, I went through 13 different strikes. And I became very jaded about corporate America and about newspapers. They were cash registers, and that's basically what they were. And my allegiance was to the workers, and I saw what they did. They produced the product. And from reporter all the way down to the newspaper carriers too. I grew up in this city, and I was a paper boy with all 4 newspapers when I was a boy. And part of our goal during that strike was to try to help the newspaper boys too, and that didn't come to fruition. But anyway, you know, I could look back on this time with the many friends that I had by my side, and look with at least some kind of pride that we were able to pull this off and bring this huge corporation to its knees, because that's basically what we did. And I think it has to do with every one of you.
I haven't studied, but of course he was a great political writer at that time, and he understood that the people who own the city, the people who run the city are the people who own the land. And of course, Progress in Poverty, his great book, explains something that the Chronicle never goes into now, which is why are there so many homeless people on the streets, so many crazies, when there is so much wealth here? I mean, lately, of course, there have been all these letters to the editor and talk, Deborah Saunders and everything about, it's just disgusting, the streets are disgusting. But they never go into why it's disgusting, why is there so much poverty when these high-rises are going up everywhere. And that takes us right back to Henry George. He explained that, of course, but they will never go there. As I found, you know, when I was trying to be a writer in the 80s, as an urban design critic, I could talk about the aesthetics of buildings, but the moment I got into land value, I was in trouble. And it was a real education for me. I think every reporter learns that lesson pretty quickly, that there are some places, if you value your career, you just don't go. I wanted to say one other thing, since we've been talking about the strike so much. The DeYoungs owned the Chronicle in '94. The Hearsts, of course, had the Examiner. And earlier, there had been a strike at the Los Angeles Examiner. Los Angeles was a 2 or 3 newspaper town at that time, and they made good on their threat. They shut it down. And I'm sure that that must have been operative in San Francisco, in the strikers' minds at that time, that very well could have happened here in San Francisco as well, too.
The end of the strike was that the San Francisco Police Department was out there all throughout that strike. It was costing the city thousands and thousands of dollars. So the mayor, Jordan, got us all down to City Hall because he wanted it to end. So the longer that strike went on, the worse it was for the city, and the pressure was on the Chronicle, because they weren't going to keep those cops out there very much longer. They told the Chronicle, this has got to end. So that had a lot to do with some pressure from City Hall on the Chronicle to end it. So when it comes to money and City Hall, believe me, if they got to put cops out on the street, they're not going to want to do it for very long, and that helped. That helped.
Yeah. I just want to say, I was planning to mention the guy, but I couldn't remember his name, and I went on for quite a while. I'll say he was an electrician. He wasn't a pressman.
He was an electrician.
Yeah, and he was one of these crackerjack electricians who thought he knew everything about electricity. So he thought that he knew a way to safely cut the main power line on Army Street, and he got killed. And I wish I could remember his name, but one thing, the union set up a scholarship program in his name. And so that was an example of the kind of militancy we had in the strike. And the last thing I want to say is Charlie's remarks were well taken, and I might have said something similar, except I'd gone on pretty long already.
The only other thing I want to add, I missed it. There was so much hostility that this company and the King and Ballou and their environment that they put on our workforce, that my members were so mad that when they got out on the picket line, believe me, they were an angry group, and I had some tough guys. And I tell you, I go to war with a lot of these guys, and that's what the Chronicle was dealing with in the Huffmasters, because I can tell you my members were pissed off, and they are tough. I remember that. Another thing that you need to know about is a Canadian company came in, and they said they would do the printing for the Chronicle. So the Chronicle, said, okay, we're gonna sign a contract with them, and then they gave us a closing contract. So the thing that gets me is that they brought in these Canadian workers, and they were given work visas in the state of California to train, non-union people to do our jobs. Somebody, I think it was Schwarzenegger or somebody in there, he was in office, gave these guys from Canada work permits to train people to take our job. So, that was another thing.
Yeah. Just one thing one of the best things about the strike was the union newspaper, exactly what you were talking about. And the thing is, it wasn't just because people in the city supported the strike, it was also a better and more interesting newspaper with less advertising, which is not a bad thing from the reader's standpoint. Well, I think it did have some advertising. In fact, John Bryan's, New Free Press had a fair amount of advertising. But it was a better and more interesting paper. and with proper, actually the typographical union has a long history going back decades, generations of trying to start separate newspapers, sometimes it's a success. And the Free Press was a better and more interesting paper than the Chronicle. And absolutely, well, maybe the future is not newspapers, maybe the future is whatever, but certainly this is part of the future. And the very last thing I want to say is, just people mentioning Bernie Sanders, I have to say Bernie Sanders' basic objective is to push Hillary Clinton to the left, and I don't think supporting Bernie Sanders is any kind of break from the two-party system, which is our problem. As the career, obviously, I should mention, by the way, there's a very long history of union radio stations and left-wing radio. In the 1930s and 1940s, one of the bigger radio stations in New York City was WEVD, EVD standing for Eugene Victor Debs, which was backed by the Socialist Party, and also had a lot of support from the garment unions at the time. So there's a long history. In terms of, I suppose, the idea of some sort of united front radio station, I guess the nearest thing to that would be Pacifica. And, well, a lot of people here know a lot about the ups and downs of Pacifica, and I'll just leave it at that.